So a risk-based approach to the AI regulation, this is not the definition I gave to the European approach to AI regulation, but is the official naming by the European institutions. This is a slide used by the European Commission to present the new proposal on which I'm sure you are familiar with on the artificial intelligence. And this is the way it is framed, a risk-based approach. So 4 groups of stratified risk. If risks are unacceptable, if the risk, I mean, in employing AI in given sectors, then in this case, the employment of AI is prohibited. When there is minimal or no risk, it is permitted with no restriction. Then there is the core part of the proposal is about high risk. In this case, when the employment of AI brings about high risk in this for society and for individuals. In this case, it is permitted, but with subject to compliance with requirement and ex-ante conformity assessment. And then there is another category which is not exclusive. So it can be, you may have transparency obligation in any of this level. In this case, you have some information or transparency obligation. So the way it is presented is a sort of formal logic, no? An if-then approach. If high risk, then permitted. If unacceptable, prohibited. If no risk, permitted with no restriction, and so on. So the way it is presented is like a sort of formal logic in the way of subsumption, if-then. What I want to show you instead is to reframe this conventional approach by showing the balancing of interest, the battleground of competing interests which are at stake here, and which is based on identifying and placing value on this interest and weighting and comparing them by the European institutions. This is another slide taken from the presentation that the European Community usually, or the institution have given in this month. And the idea is that AI is good. It's not my words, it's taken from the slide. It's good for citizens, for business, for the public interest, but at the same time, it creates some risk for the safety of consumers and users and for fundamental rights. Even here, we can see that AI is seen like a sort of purely technical system, which helps us to make better, more efficient and cheaper solution and to fix societal problems in a way that is objective and neutral and help us and assist us to make the best decision possible. So a sort of technological fix for social problems with, and we go to the right side of the screen, with some possible side effect. Not just the slide, we can find the same kind of balancing at the very beginning of the proposal in the explanatory memorandum, where we can read it together. AI can bring a lot of economic and societal benefits across the entire spectrum of industry and social activities. However, the same elements that power the socio-economic benefits can also bring about new risk or negative consequences. And then this proposal presents a balanced and proportionate horizontal regulatory approach that is limited to the minimum necessary requirement to address the risk and problems without unduly constraining or hindering technological development or otherwise disproportionately increasing the cost of placing AI solution on the market. When we talk about proportionality, balancing is one aspect of proportionality. So it's pretty clear that there is a balancing here, an attempt by the European institution to strike a balance between the use of AI in given sectors and the risk that comes with it. So let's see how this balance is stricken by. First, part is no rules for most AI system. Again, another slide taken by an official presentation. You can see that the assumption here is most AI system will not be high risk. And this is the assumption behind the proposal. And the idea is that in most cases, there is no issue in employing artificial intelligence. In this case, there is no obligation. There is the possibility, the suggestion to develop voluntary codes of conduct, but no mandatory obligation on this. And this goes to the question of the empirical premises. This is a very relevant issue in balancing. When you strike a balance between two interests, it's not just a theoretical question. There is the empirical assumption behind this balancing. And here, the idea that may be questions, we don't have time to do that, but it's interesting to pose the question, is that true that most AI systems are not bear no risk? First part of the slide. The second part of the slide is the transparency obligation for certain AI system. And the slide points to Article 52 of the proposal. I'm sure you're already familiar with it. In this case, the only obligation is to notify humans that they are interacting with an AI system, unless this is evident. So a sort of bot disclosure law that has been posed by the European Union. But what is interesting here, may be worrying for someone, that the European Union does not pose any limit to simulating human characteristics. So the possibility of counterfeiting humanity is made possible with no limit as such, unless that of notifying that you are interacting with another system. And in some cases, you may find in the second part of in the second sentence of the yellow part of this slide, for example, the use of emotional recognition is possible. And the only obligation is to disclose that a system as such is applied. So in this first balancing, we may find two characteristics which I think are worth of interest. The first one is the assumption that most systems there is no problem, and the second one is that there are no limits to the possibility to simulate human characteristic by AI, with the only duty to notify to people that they are interacting with these kind of systems. A second balancing that I want to stress here is the so-called, in the theory of law, overwhelming balance. Overwhelming balance is when one interest prevails over the other and there is a total balance. In this case, there are some cases, Title 2, Article 5 of the proposal, that the employment of AI in certain sectors contradicts EU values and is then prohibited. As an example, subliminal manipulation, which result in physical or psychological harm. And you can find in the right part of the slide some example of the employment of this kind of use, a sound that cannot be heard, and push the driver to drive longer than healthy and safe, or the exploitation of children or of mentally disabled people, resulting in physical and psychological harm. Again, you can find on the right an example. A third example is the use of the famous social scoring, a general purpose social scoring. And again, an example identifying at-risk children based on social misbehavior. Or finally, you can find the remote biometric identification. Here, the criticism for this list is that is a very, very short list that makes no reference to other uses of AI that may contradict EU values, that may bring about risk of discrimination. As an example, the employment of subliminal techniques is forbidden only if they bring or if they result in physical or psychological harms, whereas we may have the use of subliminal techniques as an example in the, I don't know, voting behavior. It's not physical, psychological harm, but it's still dangerous. And or in purchasing choices. The social scoring is prohibited only if made by public authorities. The exploitation of vulnerabilities by people is prohibited only for specific vulnerable categories, not as such. Or even more important, I have here a sticker, reclaim your face, which is for biometric identification, is prohibited not as such as this sticker wants, but only for real-time identification made by public authorities, for law enforcement. So there are so many exceptions to the possibility to use biometric identification with the risk, for example, for discrimination, for racial biases, for predictive policing, and so on. So there are many other hypotheses. There are a lot of criticism on the risk, on how short this list of prohibited, of this overwhelming balance is. And you may see it in, okay. And which is the core part of the center of the proposal is this definitional balance. Definitional balance, which is what in theory we define as the balancing process when it recognizes both interests and when no interest override the other, like in the overwhelming one we have seen before. But each one survives and it's given its due, is given its due. So in this case, we strike a balance. And this is what happened for high risk. Again, an official slide, a slide employed by the European Commission officials to present the proposal. The core part of the proposal is for high risk artificial intelligence systems. The proposal makes a distinction between the two. I say it very quickly because I'm sure you already know that I identified two different kinds of high risk employment of artificial intelligence. The first one is when artificial intelligence is employed as a safety component of a regulated product. If you employ AI in a toy, in a machinery, in a medical device, and medical devices, toys, and machinery are already subject to third-party assessment. In this case, the AI is also part of this third-party assessment and is seen as a high risk. But what is more interesting is the definition of the stand-alone AI system. In all these fields, biometric identification, critical infrastructure, education and vocational training, employment and workers management, it has been said in the previous presentation, essential services, public services, law enforcement, administration of justices and justice and democratic processes, and then migration, asylum, and border controls management. In all these sensitive fields, the proposal considers as appropriate to delegate functions in this field to AI and computers. So it's, in other words, what the proposal say, we may employ AI in law enforcement, immigration, and border control. We can use that. So there is the in this striking of a balance, the employment of artificial intelligence is given a preference, but it is subject um, to certain requirement. How this sector has been decided, what is interesting here is that all this field has been identified as field where the employment of artificial intelligence is possible but brings high risk, and then is subject to given requirement. We will see it very soon. And I want you to focus your attention on Article 7, which describes list the criteria based on that are those that brings to an amendment of Annex 3. Annex 3 is where all those sectors that we have seen on the slide before are listed. And they say we may change that list, this list we see in point 2, we may add other sector based on these criteria. The purpose of AI, how it has been used or is likely to be used, if it caused harm to health and safety or impact fundamental rights or give concerns, the extent of harms and adverse impact, whether the person impacted are dependent on the outcome or they can opt out, whether they are in a vulnerable position, whether the outcome produced by AI is reversible or not, whether it's possible to give effective measure of the redress or to prevent and to minimize this risk. So here you can see the criteria used to strike a balance between the employment of artificial intelligence and the risk, and I mean, based on the intensity of interference with rights and the degree of importance of this interest. And usually in a balance when risks are great and reason to justify the interference are sound, this brings to a total ban. Here we don't have a total ban in many of these sectors. We just have the possibility to use the artificial intelligence, and we make it subject to some requirements. But the question is, which are these requirements? And requirements, I'm going to conclude my presentation. My requirements are procedural requirements. So the only thing that must be the requirements that the proposal asks to be complied in the employment of artificial intelligence in all these fields that we have seen in the Annex 3 are procedural ones. So the use of training, validation, and testing data, the establishing of documentation in order to make possible both traceability and auditability, a certain degree of transparency with information, to ensure the existence of a human oversight, and robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. Here, what is interesting is that the human oversight is a sort of, it's not a complementary automation. So there is a sort of, in this socio-technical mix of human and robotics that the proposal display, here we have a sort of replacement I mean, by AI of the human, plus control. The employment of AI and the control by the humans. And so what is interesting here to say is that we have only procedural requirements and the same requirements for any interest and for any risk. So the first thing is that we, for high risk employment of artificial intelligence, we have procedural requirement. But what is also very important is, and this is the very last part of my presentation, is the ad hoc balance that is made, which means the small decision made, on a case-by-case basis that are those that will shape the way AI will be developed. Who make the decision in real life case? And you may see that this decision, I take just 3 articles, but we may find others that employ indeterminate criteria, vague criteria, which are indefinite. So, for example, the risks which are acceptable, the implementation of this quality management system, Article 17, must be proportionate to the size of the organization or proportionate to the nature of artificial intelligence or technology and the risk. So the decision whether the requirement employed for the use of artificial intelligence in high-risk sectors is based on a case-by-case basis on very ample and vague criteria, and this element must be coupled with another aspect which I consider to be extremely interesting, that is the assessment of these criteria is delegated to the same providers of artificial intelligence. So the employment of artificial intelligence in high-risk sectors where the striking of the balance I showed before make it possible to use artificial intelligence in very sensitive sectors are only subject to procedural requirement with an ad hoc balance made by the same providers of artificial intelligence. So we have a self-enforcement of high-risk employment of artificial intelligence with internal control checks by the provider, with the only exception of biometric identification system, which is the only high-risk employment of artificial intelligence which is subject to third-party conformity assessment. So what I wanted to describe in this presentation is the distinction between is the complex balancing that is made by the proposal, which is not just an if-then approach to the artificial intelligence. So my presentation based on a risk-based approach wanted to uncover this if-then formal logic approach that is given if unacceptable risk then prohibited, if a risk permitted, if no risk permitted with no requirement, with the striking of balance which is made in the proposal. And the striking of balance have some empirical assumption. Most high risk, most systems are bear no risk, which may be questionable, with no limits to the possibility of counterfeiting humanity, only so with this system only subject to transparency requirement, with a high risk with the employment of artificial intelligence in high-risk sector, which is subject only to procedural requirement, and the implementation of this procedural requirement delegated to the same providers of the services. Which is the kind of balancing that is made. This is pretty clear in the declaration of Margaret Vestager, the Executive Vice President for European Fit for the Digital Area, and Thierry Breton, which is the Commissioner for Internal Market. These 2 declarations are taken from the press released, and they say, by setting the standards, we can pave the way to ethical technology worldwide and ensure that the EU remains competitive along the way. And the same with different wording, Thierry Breton said, today's proposal aims to strengthen Europe's position as a global hub of excellence in AI from the lab to the market, ensure that AI in Europe respect our values and rules and harness the potential. So the striking of balance that European institution had in mind is to protect EU values, but at the same time to put Europe in the global competition for AI. The point is on here is that the proposal need to be discussed widely in these months and years before its approval, because it has a minimalistic approach to artificial intelligence we have seen at the beginning in the executory summer. It gives high margin of appreciation with these vague criteria. These margin of appreciation are delegated to those ones who are controlled, and the risk is that we are going to make a balancing made in a black box. We cannot be subject to public scrutiny. And so the debate, a debate is much needed on this regard, because we must prevent the risk of impairing the current level of protection of values and rights in the European Union. Thanks.